Matt Miguez has plenty on his mind, and he's ready to share it with the world. It's time to hear the Miguez Mindset.
Welcome into another edition of the Miguez Mindset here on ESPN 103.7 Lafayette and 104.1 Lake Charles. Matt Miguez here. Finally figured out our YouTube channel situation. YouTube channel was down for a long time, but it's finally back. So more podcast and content coming your way here, and we're going to kick it off with a huge one, talking about the New Orleans Saints with our guy Ross Jackson, the host of the Locked On Saints podcast. Ross, really appreciate you taking the time as always, my friend. How are you?
Oh man, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on. I always look forward to chopping it up with you and love doing it in this format too, man. This is really fun. So thanks for having me on.
So, question number one that I want to really dive into is, you look at the Saints game last week against the Houston Texans,
hmm
and the Saints have a notorious history of struggling a little bit with rookie quarterbacks. And obviously, you're facing a rookie in CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans. And I don't want to say that the Saints maybe debunked that theory, because CJ Stroud played, decent. He played fairly well. But what were your thoughts on the game as a whole, especially from the offensive side, just barely managing to put up any points yet again?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so the two different conversations there in terms of how they've managed against rookie quarterbacks. Rookie quarterbacks used to be a big time issue for them for sure. I mean, you think back to the RG3 days and all those other things, but really since Dennis Allen's been around, I think it's including the CJ Stroud game, I think it's 9 of the last 12 games that they've gone up against rookie quarterbacks, and in some of those games, rookie quarterbacks have still had good games. You know what I mean? They've still had good output. They still had good moments, things like that. But they've done a really good job of not being thrashed by these rookie quarterbacks anymore. And they were in line to see another one before the end of this year in Anthony Richardson, but it looks like that's not going to be the case. It looks like Anthony Richardson for the Indianapolis Colts is potentially shut down for the year. But they've done a really, really good job, to your point, of debunking or kind of changing the tune of what that history has been. And that is a welcome adjustment in New Orleans. I can promise you that. As for the offensive side of the football, the second part there, uh, man, throw a dart, dude. Like when it comes to like what's wrong with this offense right now, I know that there's a lot of people that will point to play calling. They're right. They'll point to Derek Carr. They're right. They'll point to Dennis Allen. They're right. They'll point to the receivers, the offensive line. They'll point to the execution. They're all right. Like that's the thing, and I think that that's the thing to keep in mind when it comes to where the New Orleans Saints offense is that if it was just one particular problem, they would have been able to solve it. I think Alvin Kamara said something to that effect after his first game back a couple of weeks ago. But the bigger issue has been that now for 23 games straight, so going beyond just the 6 games that they played so far this season, but then the 17 they played last year, we're seeing a lot of the same issues for this New Orleans Saints team. And that's really, really concerning that they haven't been able to kind of get things changed around. And now they're starting to have conversations around simplifying the offense. They're starting to have conversations around how, communication's not working and that players don't know what they should be doing in certain moments and certain plays and things like that. And that is not a conversation we should be having in October.
Now, you bring all that up, and I don't disagree with you that, kind of the whole throw a dart mentality, it's all right kind of thing. Um, but what would you say if maybe one outweighs the other?
Yeah, yeah.
In your opinion, what do you think the biggest issue is for this team?
Yeah, if I had to pick sort of the biggest thing, the most pervasive issue, I would go back to the system. I would go back to this scheme. I thought that it was the wrong decision for this New Orleans Saints team to try to continue on Sean Payton's system without Sean Payton in the first place. And that goes all the way back to the beginning of, the offseason of the 2022 year. It didn't make sense. And now you're seeing Sean Payton try to run his Sean Payton system with Sean Payton because he's Sean Payton and is failing to be able to do that in Denver as well. Now, we'll see what happens if that Sean Payton system happens to work its way into a Caleb Williams or a Drake May, how much of a difference that makes. But clearly, running this system without Sean Payton, and maybe even more importantly, without Drew Brees, was never going to work. And so finding another way to get this done or to revamp this offense, or at least get this offense into the modern day era of the NFL, play action, crossers, motion. I mean, all the things that we've actually seen this New Orleans Saints do to an extent before, but sort of entering the wide zone conversation would have been a much more advantageous way for the New Orleans Saints to spend their offseason this past offseason, but they didn't do that. And so they decided to run it back. And so when you look at things like lack of effort, To me, that's indicative of a larger issue, maybe a lack of belief in the system, maybe a lack of usability, maybe all of those things. You look at the quarterback can only run the system that they're being given, and whether that quarterback's checking in or checking out of plays, he's not just doing that with random plays out of the playbook. There's two plays called in the huddle, so whether the play works or whether the play doesn't, whether it's the first play or the second play, that's a play call problem, right? So yeah, receivers running into the same areas of the field, that's a play design problem. Not being able to get players into the system to the point where they can execute it flawlessly, that's a system issue. That's a coaching issue. So for me, I kind of go back to the system as a whole, going all the way back to 2022 season where they had an opportunity to update the offense and get into the modern day lens and refused to do it.
Now, one positive with this team so far has been the defense. Pete Warner's having a strong year with 43 tackles. Carl Granderson might be one of the most underrated defensive linemen in all of football, with 4.5 sacks so far to the year. What's kind of been the secret for them? I mean, obviously, having a head coach that is a defensive coordinator by trade probably helps. But what's been the secret to the defense's success over the last year and a half?
Yeah, I mean, I can flip this immediately on what we just talked about. Trying to run Sean Payton's offensive system without Sean Payton's offensive system is not working, but trying to run Dennis Allen's defensive system with Dennis Allen is working perfectly, right? Like, here's an example for you of how all of that works. But I think that what you see from the New Orleans Saints defense is, even though they had all that changeover on the defensive side, they quickly built cohesion. They quickly built kind of trust amongst one another. I asked Cam Jordan about that in his Tuesday media availability before the Jaguars game, in which he mentioned that they spend a lot of time off the field together. And so if they can get a clear line of communication off the field, it becomes an organic thing on the field. And you can sort of see that relationship there and how that works. But then you look at the second level and the third level of this New Orleans Saints team, the linebackers and the secondary. These are all guys that were there last year and in the system last year and that dominated last year and that played very well last year. The Saints weren't great against the run in 2022, but they were still a top 3 passing defense in the NFL. And so you're seeing sort of that back end of the defense just kind of keep its reputation going as a whole. But to their credit, those 5 guys in the secondary, in terms of what was going to be their starting secondary, never played a snap together last year. So getting all that talent out on the field and having a system that supports that talent and puts that talent in position to excel and succeed, and everybody understands their roles, their responsibilities on any given moment, any given play, that is turning out to be the right thing for this New Orleans Saints defense. And so if you can take that same type of, hey, here's what works for the defense, can it work for the offense, kind of gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what's missing over there.
Now, Ross, before we start previewing this Thursday night matchup with the Jaguars, at the beginning of the season, you bring in Derek Carr, you get a healthy Michael Thomas, you get some young pieces defensively. Alontae Taylor steps into his second year after a big rookie season. If I would have told you through 6 games that this team would be 3-3, you would have told me what?
I think I had them predicted to be 2-2 and then 4-2 at this time. So it would have only been one game off of my initial prediction. Now, if you would have told me it was going to happen like this, then I would have said that's wild, because there's way too much talent on this team for this team to have, to score more than 20 points once or whatever it's been, right? 21 points once and all that. So I think that's the part that I probably would have reacted to more than the record itself. But I think that this team is kind of right around where I expected them to be through the first 6 games. Anytime that you change a quarterback, you're going to have some growing pains. You just didn't expect the growing pains to be this severe, I think, is the issue. So there's the question of the record, which the defense has helped out with, which special teams has helped out with. But then there's also the question of the offense's inability to produce. That's the part that would have been most shocking to me.
Now, Ross, let's look at this game with the Jaguars tomorrow night. You look at it, Trevor Lawrence may play. Recent reports appear that he probably will play because his knee is rapidly improving. But you look at it, it's either Trevor Lawrence or CJ Beathard.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big tip of
Big
the
gap
scale there.
there.
Um, so for from a defensive perspective, how do you prepare for that? Not knowing who's going to be under center. The likely answer would be you just prepare for Trevor Lawrence, right?
Yeah, that's basically it. You prepare for Trevor Lawrence. You get a little familiar with what CJ Beathard can do, and if he does anything, specifically differently. Beathard's taken one snap in his entire career against the New Orleans Saints. It was years ago when he came in for one, like maybe I think he threw one pass for the when he was the backup to Nick Mullins for the San Francisco 49ers years back. So there's not a lot there. There's not a lot of tape on CJ Beathard to begin with. So just kind of get an idea from what you can, whether it's preseason or otherwise, of what it is that he does well and if it's unique. But the thing about Trevor Lawrence is that Trevor Lawrence is so unique. He can throw, he can run, he can extend plays, he can do all these things that if you prepare for Trevor Lawrence, it's kind of a catch-all for preparing for just about any quarterback that's out there or any backup quarterback that would be out there. The biggest key, though, is preparing for the weapons that either one of those quarterbacks is going to have. And I think that if they prepare for them, focus in on how they limit guys like Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram and Travis Etienne and all these guys, the weapons that they have on the offensive side, then they'll be in good position on the defensive side one way or another, regardless of who's at quarterback.
Man, how good has Travis Etienne been? Not just this year, but in his entire career. I mean, that guy has just been fantastic.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun to watch, and he was one of those guys that was on the brink of being a disappointment, right? Like he came out of Clemson, and he was this incredible running back out of Clemson, but then dealt with some health stuff early on, the Urban Meyer year, all of these things that were kind of there that kind of got in his way. But he has not let any of that slow him down, and he's a big time weapon, whether it's in the run game, which Jacksonville Jaguars are like an okay rushing offense, but what he can also do in the passing game and how he can be a good complement to that kind of stable of backs that they have. I mean, he's an incredible talent and kind of obviously getting him and Trevor Lawrence, they have the communication from when they were together at Clemson, all of that too. But man, it's something else to watch this guy. And it kind of reminds me of Mark Ingram. Like when Mark Ingram came into the NFL, he was a Heisman Trophy winner, all this stuff. And then he kind of struggled early on in his career as they were trying to figure out how to best utilize him. He just kept at it, had some injury things, kept at it. And then up until recently was the team's or I guess right now still is the team's rushing touchdowns leader and everything. And that, has become such a big part of this New Orleans Saints organization. It's fun to watch another younger guy like Travis Etienne kind of have a similar trajectory of kind of overcoming that early adversity.
All right, Ross, I know a lot of people asked for a change in offensive play caller after that game in Houston. Obviously, you're not going to make a change with a 4-day turnaround, right?
Right.
But with there being a mini buy,
Mm-hmm.
as some people like to call it, if there's another bad offensive performance against Jacksonville tomorrow night, could the Saints be looking to make a change at offensive play caller?
I think what I'll say is one way or another. And what I mean by that is that if this is another bad, offensive output, and if you can draw the line on this back to the system, the offensive coordinator, the play caller, whatever, if you can clearly draw that line, then I think that there has to be some conversation about revamping the approach on offense. That could mean changing the play caller. That could mean simply revamping the approach on offense, right? Like there's a couple of different ways you can go about that. It's hard to do that midseason, and very few teams who change play callers during the season find success. Historically, it's not a thing. There's maybe one or two, examples. I think you have to go back to 2002 when actually it was Sean Payton. They took the play calling responsibilities away from Sean Payton in New York, and then went 7-2 afterwards for the Giants when I think it was Jim Fassel took over for those. And so I think you have to kind of weigh, do you have an experienced play caller on your staff? Which the answer to that is no. But do you have somebody that's promising enough, like maybe a Ronald Curry, that it just gives you an opportunity to go out and see what he can do? The question is, can he be successful? And would he be more successful than what you already have? Now, it's easy to say, well, they can't get any worse, but they most certainly can. I mean, offense around the NFL stinks right now, all across the league. And so I think you want to be really careful about that. But I think that when I say one way or another, it's, do you make an immediate change at offensive play caller, or does this game end up kind of being the end all be all in terms of the decisions that need to be made this offseason? And I think that is the great possibility, or like the greater possibility of the two.
All right. Now, I know looking at this game, I know you have keys to victory. So if the Saints want to have a little bit of momentum going into this 10-day break, what has to happen tomorrow night in the Superdome?
Yeah, it all comes down to the defense for me. The Saints will not win a shootout with the Jacksonville Jaguars. That cannot be the case here, and so it has to be all on the defense. And the good news is that the Saints have blueprint. They've got personnel. They've got the system that matches up well against the Jacksonville Jaguars. You look to earlier this season, Jacksonville only scored 3 points against the Kansas City Chiefs. That Spags defense, what do? They walk up to the line of scrimmage. They play press man coverage. They go single high at safety. They dare you to throw the ball against their defense, and they come with their 4 pass rushers using twist stunts and every now and then supplemental pass rush. That should sound familiar because that's what Dennis Allen and the New Orleans Saints do as well. Calvin Ridley was a guy, over the course that 2-game losing streak, the only 2 games that Jacksonville has lost so far this season, Kansas City as well as Houston, he was limited big time in those games to catching only 2 or 4 passes under 40 yards in each of those games. L'Jarius Sneed for the Kansas City Chiefs did a great job of just manning up on him, and I think he was targeted 5 times in Sneed's coverage, only allowed 2 catches. You need to see that kind of game from Marshawn Lattimore or Paulson Adebo, however they decide to match all of this up, whether they play sides or whether they shadow. But I think that becomes the biggest key is, playing to your system's strength and therefore daring Jacksonville to throw and performing against it. For the New Orleans Saints offense, I think the biggest key is learn to take what a defense is giving you. You don't have to go deep every single play. You don't have to consistently take those shots. That was one of the big things that was like a big issue that everybody talked about when it came to Jameis Winston. We're seeing it now as a part of the system as opposed to regardless of which quarterback is under center. So you have to get that fixed, and you have to be able to play with calm composure. And I don't think that we saw that from the New Orleans Saints last week. When you look at Houston and what they did against Jacksonville, 12 of 20 passes that CJ Stroud completed during that game were in the middle of the field, and only, and I think it was 11 of them were in the middle of the field and within 10 yards. Take what the defense gives you and matriculate the ball down the field as opposed to trying to completely live or die by the deep ball.
Ross Jackson, the host of the Locked On Saints podcast, joining us here on a Wednesday edition of the Miguez Mindset. Ross, appreciate your time as always, my friend. And before you run, tell our listeners where they can find you.
Yeah, man, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me on. If you want more on the New Orleans Saints, you can find Locked On Saints wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. You can also find written work over at Saints News Network, which is Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints. You can find that online at saints.media. You can find all of it in one place on Twitter or whatever social media it is these days at Ross Jackson Nola, Nola.
Ross, once again, man, really appreciate your time. Great work as always. And we'll be back on Friday with a conversation about LSU and the Louisiana Raging Cajuns. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel at ESPN Southwest Louisiana, as well as all social media platforms at ESPN_SWLA. We'll be back on Friday right here on the Miguez Mindset.